Like you said, people die, but their ideas live on, right? In the Chicano movement, the people, Corky Gonzalez, all those people are gone. But Chicano, you can't talk about Mexican culture in the United States today without talking about the movement, el movimiento, right? The Chicano movement. There's kind of like a dialectic between the idea of American and Mexican, right? Whereas before the Chicano movement, Mexican-American meant a Mexican who was like an Anglo-American. Mm-hmm. After the Chicano movement, and like you see with Unidos USA and all that stuff, Mexican-Americanism comes back, but now it's changed by the Chicano movement. So now it's Mexican-American means an American who is Mexican. Not that they're like an Anglo-American, but that American now means something bigger than it meant in the 50s.
I think that's a really good explanation. That before it was, like primarily American and then Mexican American. After the Chicano means you can be both,
right?
And lots of folks are like, oh, that makes sense,
right?
And so I think that's.
But you needed the really Chicano movement for that, right? You needed the Chicano movement for that.
And it gets a little bit messy. I talk a little bit in the conclusion of where, where's kind of belonging getting mapped out, right? That you did have like the decade of the Hispanic or like the 90s, where somehow they were going to be, right, like Latinos are becoming mainstream. And then you get into, but right under the surface, right, you have this kind of anti-Latino sentiment crop up. And then you get kind of this frustration of, well, we tried all these different ways. What are we going to do now, right? Like if that where American true and loyal failed, and then the Chicano, brown is beautiful, Chicano power didn't work, kind of the Hispanic consumer identity was elevated, right? It became ascendant in the 80s and 90s. And now we're starting to see like, what's that going to entail, right? I think I kind of couch it in, if you like the term or not, like neoliberalism, right? Like it's a liberal neoliberalism, but what do we do about it, right? And I kind of showed in the LDC's attempt to think about Latinos as like a GDP, right? They call it like the Latino GDP. And so here we have this idea of like the nation, right? That's how we measure a nation's productivity and GDP. But this isn't a nation within a nation of like internal colonialism or Aztlan, like the Chicanos talked about it, or a Mexico de afuera. This is a purely kind of almost like capitalist understanding of why this community is valuable. And it's almost not because they're socially valuable. It's just because they have dollars. Like their social value is because they have this many billions of dollars to spend. But how successful is that going to be, right? To reduce these people to like dollars spent.
In the 50s, it's, Mexican Americanism is like saying, you should be happy that Mexicans are here because we're American. We serve in our country. We have American values. And now it's like, you should welcome Mexicans and Latinos because they're good for capitalism.
Yeah. You see those changes, you think of, the Frito Bandito ad, right? Like that's the way they used to. And then you kind of switch it to like, Coca-Cola putting like the old English on their bottles or something to try to get Latinos, or having, the NFL have like Latino month or whatever.
Yeah. It's kind of creepy to connect human worth to economic value, right?
Yeah.
The more economic value you potentially have, that is a measure of your human worth, right? About how much we're going to welcome you into our community.
What does that mean for belonging in the 21st century? I don't, it's messy. It's super messy. And I don't know how successful yet Latinos as dollars, like our belonging purely based on consumption.
It's ugly. It doesn't feel nice.
Strategy. So belonging as like this kind of spirit or essence, right? Like if I'm thinking about back to the book, if we begin the 20th century as like Mexicanness or belonging as this kind of like ethereal, spiritual or right? Like essence, changing to, right, like citizenship as belonging, and that not working, right? To now we're getting into the 21st century as belonging as consumption or belonging as money.
Your belonging was in your heart in the 20s and 30s, and then it's in your documents, and now it's in your pocket, right? Now it's in your wallet. That's crazy, Tying human worth to economic value is problematic. That's my academic word. Is problematic. We might have to unpack that because in light of American racism, right? Because like that's why it feels icky to tie Latino worth to the potential consuming power of the Latino market, because we know that the economic playing field isn't fair. And so if the system is saying you guys are only as valuable as much money you bring to the table, so make as much money as you can and be as successful as you can, that's all well and good if there's a fair playing field, but there's not. So that's saying, here, you need to do this for us to respect you, but we're going to do everything in our power to keep you from doing this.
I don't know if it'd be any less troubling, right? Kind of belonging or identity as your economic value, right? But it would certainly be a little less troubling if everybody was on an equal economic playing field, right? But we know that there's these built-in structural inequalities that, if not addressed, are going to perpetuate those same inequalities. And again, if we're saying you're only worth as much as you make, well, there's real structures that keep Latinos from making as much. So that, again, that's why that is so troubling. You know?
We're laughing because we're so fucking worried, right? Like we know that there's a mess. We're in a mess, and we know that it's going to get messier.
Laugh because you can't cry, right? Like laugh because it's absurd in a horrible way. Absurd.